Welcome one and all to Influence Music Podcast. We exploring new music and making connections back to previous musical generations via panel debates, conversations and interviews with artists, enthusiasts and media insiders.
Welcome to episode 6 of Influence Music Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Williams. Thank you for joining us. Today we are talking about music released in the UK in the year 2000. Joining me today to have this discussion is my good friend, contributor to my blog, Lee the New Beatmaker. Lee, what's happening?
Mark, thank you yet again for having me on the show today. Listeners, thank you. I hope you are all safe and well.
The year 2000, it's something that me and Lee discussed to do a show about because it was one of those years, for some reason, we just got hit with such a bunch of great albums. I mean, it's ridiculous. I don't know a year like it where I've so many influential albums that kind of changed the direction of artists or of what they had done previously or the future of the way that we listened to or produced music. So we've got a list here, but before we start going through the list of albums, I think we need to kind of discuss one of the reasons or some of the reasons why we think it was such a good year. I mean, obviously we went into the millennium. It was a big thing for us. For all you youngsters that don't remember it, it was all over the news for multiple reasons. A new millennium, the millennium bug, moving into the future, etc., etc. Musically, though, it was very different than it is today. It was still very focused on selling albums, selling actual units of music. That's what record labels made their money, and that's what artists did to get the better deals. So having a body of work was more important than having a hit song. Streaming hadn't started. This was before Apple Music or before Spotify or Tidal or any of those streaming services. In fact, I don't believe that iTunes was actually launched until 2001. That was even before iTunes, which means it probably before the iPod. We're talking about an era of music where we were still consuming tapes, vinyls and mainly CDs. That had a massive impact on the music that was being produced, right, Lee?
Yes, absolutely.
With that being said, artists were very focused on then moving those units. So we weren't really so focused on having lots of hit singles. It was having a hit single to sell your album. So when you used to get an album, there was a lot of unheard music that hadn't been on the radio, music that hadn't been videos for. So it was a kind of an excitement to purchasing CDs and purchasing albums at that point, because we never really knew what we were going to get. You never knew what direction the project was going to go. And that suspense added to the experience. I suppose the next point of call would be music sharing, Lee, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Mark Williams just perfectly encapsulated, in my mind, music in the year 2000. For brevity, some would argue that the year 2000 was the year of Napster. I'm no expert, and again, my own reminiscences at the time and whatnot. A show like this, I go back to my nostalgia and, I remember playing this tune and this happening. But with that comes a little bit of, I'm not saying things which are set in stone and this date and that date. So if you want to look into the history of Napster, go check it out on Wikipedia, Napster. I would say that the Apple, the iPods and so on and so forth could have even have been a reaction to a new musical landscape where Napster was a file sharing service where the internet suddenly became, for want of a better phrase, more powerful and more accessible. And people were downloading whole albums and catalogues of music in a way that they never had been able to before. And the music industry faced an existential crisis. Record companies and artists were looking to still sell albums as, for want of a better phrase, their bread and butter in the year 2000. I would imagine record labels were going, we're selling a lot of records today, but holy shit, the goose that lays the golden egg is gone. This might be the last year, and I'd have to go back and research, but this might be the last year of the mega selling album. It's a conversation and a documentary in its own right, and we sound like old heads, but it's different to how it is now.
A good reference point for that is the documentary that I always come back to is The Defiant Ones, because at the time this happened, Jimmy Irvine probably had one of the most successful record labels in Interscope, and even though he was one of the bodies that were in the lawsuit case against Napster, he also said at that point, and he says it in the documentary, he knew that was it. At that point, whether they won the case or not, that the landscape, like you said, would never be the same again.
Yeah.
And that was that he started to try and work with Apple back then in the year 2000, even though it didn't come to fruition until 10 years later. Let's get back to the music. That's what we're here for. So the list is pretty fast. So we're going to go through a catalogue of albums, and we're just going to talk about some of our favourite ones from the list. So the first one that I've got on the list, which is an album that really iconic, I suppose it's up there in the top 5 iconic albums of the year, would be Radiohead's Kid A.
Wow. Yeah.
I would say that because it was so different to anything we'd previously experienced. It was a amalgamation of multiple genres. Most of the time people tried to be genre specific back then. And nowadays we're a lot more music genre fluid. But Radiohead was kind of in your feels, hip hop meets rock. It was deep, it was dark, but it was quite inspiring at the same time. It was emotionally and politically motivated. And it was also one of those albums which, for a US market, which is quite rare, it crossed ethnic genres. So yeah, it was a massive album. What did you feel about that one?
Very influenced by Aphex Twin, of course, who himself was influenced, I would say, by the Miami bass sound and all this type of stuff. We've talked before about artists making an effort to cross over, and you can smell the crossover attempt, the tryhards, and then there's people who just love various different types of music, and they just put it all out there, and different types of people go, this resonates with us on various levels. Kid A is one of those albums. People talk about it so much, I call it the What's Going On syndrome. People talk about What's Going On by Marvin Gaye a lot because it's so damn good. I say that about Donuts, I say that about Pimp a Butterfly, and I say that about Radiohead's Kid A.
So the next album on the list we're not going to talk too much about because I don't think there's a person in the whole wide world that's never heard this album or a track off this album. Eminem album, the Eminem Marshall Mathers LP, which it was probably the album that sold the most units in the year, I would have thought, don't you?
If we were on a quiz show, I would say that as my first reaction. So I can't say for sure, but if you were wrong.
It was highly popular. It was extremely successful. It was extremely controversial. A lot of the controversy came from the fact that we had a white rapper that was anti-establishment, that had hit the mainstream, very much like NWA had, and we hadn't seen that before. It had happened, but they'd pretty much stayed in the hip-hop genre and not crossed over to kind of mainstream pop commercial success. We'll move on to the next one, which was Craig David's Born to Do It. This was probably the biggest UK album of the year by a UK artist. It was extremely influenced from the garage scene, which kind of started at 95 until 2000. Craig David had done a lot of work with the Artful Dodger at that point. He'd also, I believe, written a couple of tracks for Damage that they'd performed. I love this album, but off air I was talking to Liam. I was just saying that as much as I love it, and I still think it's really iconic, and I think everybody should listen to it and have it in their collection. It has got some hit singles on it, like 7 Days, like Fill Me In. I also feel like this is one of the albums on the list that has dated more than some of the others. It is on the list because it deserves to be, but I also feel that it is kind of the music content and the production style and the fusion of the garage and the hip hop and what was the UK urban scene then has dated because it's moved forward so far and the transition has been so vast to where we are today that it does a little bit feel like it is a 20-year-old album, which makes me feel old. Next album on the list is one of mine and Lee's favourites. It's Ghostface Killah's Supreme Clientele. I'll let Lee talk about this album because it was special for me. All you hip-hop heads out there, I know you love it and I know why you love it. Just give us a little bit of your thoughts on it, Lee.
Some people argue that Supreme Clientele is the greatest solo rap album of all time. I tend to stay out of arguments about what's the greatest because I think it's so subjective, but I'm not annoyed when people say this. But from a production standpoint, salute to all the producers on this album for giving this such a Wu-Tang feel and authentic Wu-Tang soul without trying to copy RZA. I think some of the stuff on there that is RZA, I want to say the most incredible. I mean, experimental can be a nice way of saying weird and doesn't work, but the experimental beat on Stroke of Death, I mean, how you get basically an offbeat scratched record and MCs flowing over it in the way they do. Ghostface is an MC's MC. His flow is insane. His voice is 1 in a million. And the stories he paints can be terrifying, heartbreaking, all-inspiring, stooped in black pride, comical, all on the same track. I could go through every single track, the storytelling on Malcolm. There were points on Supreme Clientele that to me almost sounded like a religious text. But apart from the anti-gay marriage line, because without talking about politics, I support gay marriage, the song Mighty Healthy could arguably be the greatest rap song of all time. Ghostface goes over the Skull Snap synthetic substitution breakbeat. He peppers the track with all sorts of free association, references to the New Testament, to the slain pop icon Selena, talking about childhood adolescence and vegetarianism and all this stuff, where if I talk like that, I sound super incoherent. But somehow Ghostface just seems to be free associating all these different worldviews. If you want to be an MC, you don't have to sound like that, but listen to that record again and again and again, up in the fucking mountains like some sort of novice Buddhist monk like Dr. Strange or something, because that is MCing on a whole other level. Supreme Clientele is the sound of an MC going from strength to strength, and the sound of a production team who stepped up and, sounds very management speak, went above and beyond.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I kind of feel like it's the pinnacle of the Wu-Tang Clan, in my opinion. I feel like...
I'm not mad at that.
I feel that no one can make you feel like you're actually on the block with him more than Ghostface can, because his storytelling is second to none. And for the younger generation, comparison would be Ghostface for hip-hop MC is like what DEE is to the grime MC. In a sense,
right.
MC's MC. So like,
yes.
If you ask Skepta or Wiley or who their favourite MC was, they're all going to say DEE. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
The talent's just there. Great album. And moving on to the next one, which we've referenced in our very first episode. It's Since I Left You by the Avalanches. I know Lee's a massive fan of it. We've spoke about it before, so we won't go into too much detail. But it was made by a conglomerate of hip hop collectives from Australia. Beatmakers that made a fabulous album. It's a must-have in everybody's music collection. Go out and get it in whatever format you can. Moving on to that is one of my favourite albums of all time, D'Angelo's Voodoo. Now this is a really difficult album for anybody, because Brown Sugar was so good that personally I was always worried that he would have the second album syndrome. It's really, really hard that when your first album's a classic and you've prepared and written and motivated yourself to get to that point for so many years, that within a 2-year cycle you've got to produce another one when that album took you maybe 20, 30 years to make. So I was always what's he going to do? And it's completely different. Like, it didn't even follow the same direction, and it's even just as brilliant. And I'll let you talk about it.
Well, I am mindful that I talked about Supreme Clientele for longer than I meant to. Voodoo could be my favourite album of all time. I could even though I don't like getting into arguments about what's the greatest album, when I get a bit between my teeth, I won't let go, so I could even maybe argue that it's the greatest album of all time. I think that's similar to, and Mark Williams just encapsulated something that I didn't put forward about Supreme Clientele. Wu-Tang albums aside, Supreme Clientele was Ghostface Killer's sophomore album, his second album. His first album, Iron Man, is fantastic. And as Mark says, arguments are had about the difficult second album. I mean, they call it things like the sophomore slump and the sophomore jinx for a reason. And again, I think we can talk about this more at a later date. But Ghostface did a classic album called Iron Man. And then his second album arguably knocks Iron Man out of the park. So think about an album that you could say is 8 out of 10, and then coming out with an album that's 10 out of 10. As crude as that is, again, a bit like Supreme Clientele, it was it was an album that was very much D'Angelo in himself and his own genius, but also testament to having other people around you. There were certain eras in music where it was death by too many producers and too many features. That's an episode for another time. But also the argument that you need a certain amount of people around you to keep you all on focus for the common cause. So think about how I said Supreme Clientele had a bunch of producers all working for a common cause, and they seem to be able to balance out one another. This is also the case for Voodoo, where you have very slow, almost bedroom jams to Spanish jazz kind of tunes, to a DJ Premier hip-hop tune that doesn't sound out of place on what is a soul and a funk album. It's a very sad story about how D'Angelo was treated by the music industry in a very interesting... I think we all know about sexism and objectivity for female artists in the music industry. D'Angelo, I think, was one of the first men that I ever saw that suffered objectivity and so on and so forth. But Voodoo is, there isn't a note, there isn't a sung phrase, there isn't a bass line, there isn't a kick, there isn't a snare that is out of place. Jay Dilla, Raphael Sadiq, Questlove, I want to say Bob Power mixing. Prince meets A Tribe Called Quest meets, I could talk about it all day and I'm not doing it justice. So listen to what Mark said. Ignore what I'm waffling about and just go put it on and enjoy. Just go put it on and
I
enjoy.
agree. I mean, it goes from being quite religious and dark and cultish from tracks like Devil's Pie, right through to getting you up tempo, then lifted with Spanish Joint. It's just a great album. It's just a really good album. Moving on, a commercial success album, which we've got to talk about, has to be Nelly's Country Grammar. It was big, it was different. He kind of went down the route of that St. Louis rap that we hadn't heard before, very similar to what Bone Thugs and Harmony had done in the past with that kind of rhythmic tempo. It was a huge
sing-song.
Yeah, it was commercially viable, so out to Nelly on that. The next album is the opposite to what we were saying before. It was the best comeback album that could possibly have been ever. And this is The Lox, We Are the Streets.
Right.
Fundamentally saying that because The Lox originally signed to Bad Boy. They were referred to Puffy through Mary J. Blige. He signed them, and I just felt he didn't really know what to do with them. And at the time, he was having all this airplay and all this commercial success on the label. He tried to get them involved in that. But when it came to making their own album, they lost a lot of their street edge. A lot of people accused them of selling out. Jadakiss didn't seem to hit so hard. It just didn't really work. So they left the label and they went with Interscope / Rough Riders. They brought out this second album and I think it was a hit. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed it. One of my tunes of the year would have been Ride or Die Bitch, produced by Timbaland, to come off that album. I felt each member of the group really came into their own and it pushed them forward for their individual success as well. We really got to know The Lox. So yeah, it's a good album, one to have in your list. Definitely check it out. The next one on our list is Commons, like Water for Chocolate. Lee's been talking about this album since the last episode. I know he's biting at the bit to get at this. Go on.
Since the last episode, I've been talking about this album since the day it came out. I'll be sat on the pre-COVID days. I'll be sat on the train talking to random strangers about this album. This is a album that, again, I'm mindful that I'm waffling and pontificating a little bit. I would say, dear listener, if your introduction to a quintessential hip-hop album, which somehow is both quintessentially hip-hop but is also jazz and soulful, and can deal with playful issues as well as issues of black consciousness and so on and so forth, was Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, do yourself a big favour and go back and check out Like Water for Chocolate from the year 2000. I would say that this is purely from a reviewing standpoint and there's no bashing here. I don't think Common as an MC has ever claimed to be as lyrically dexterous as Kendrick Lamar, but he holds his own, more than holds his own. And again, you've got this era of ensemble pieces, albums, following on from the Ghostface Killer album, and Voodoo by D'Angelo. And Voodoo by D'Angelo's album intercedes with many of the people that are on this album or in the background, known as the Soulquarians, which Mark will, I'm sure, bring up at a later episode. But I really think that, again, apart from some I'm not here to police people, but of course there's certain words and things that are used where maybe even Common himself wouldn't use them now. So maybe you wouldn't want to play it around the kids and so on and so forth, and maybe not safe for work in one way. But it's an hour of an MC exploring different facets of his own psyche, the Black experience, Black American music, past, present, and I would say future, seeing as 15, 16 years later. I love To Pimp a Butterfly, and I kind of called To Pimp a Butterfly a mixture of Illmatic, Doggy Style, The Chronic, and this album, Common, Like Water for Chocolate.
I'm a fan of that album as well. We've got to go into a market that we don't really talk about, I suppose, in some respects. It's kind of hip-hop, but it's also Latin hip-hop, because we're talking about Big Pun's Yeah Baby. Now, this album was released posthumously, so after Big Pun had died in February 2000. And I think the album was released in April. It's pre-J-Lo, it's pre-Shakira, it's pre-Enrique Iglesias, it's pre that Latin content invading the mainstream US market. Now, so I think that had a massive effect on the commercial viability and the commercial success of both Big Pun's albums. This is Big Pun's second album. But taking that aside, it was still fantastic. I mean, it's a great album. It has those kind of fun, light-hearted tracks. It has a Puerto Rican anthem in 100%. It has some kind of really dark, lyrically twisted tracks like Leatherface that are hard hitting. So good. Lyrical content there. It's just a must-have. There's also a few hip-hop beefs on there. I believe he calls out 50 Cent at one point because 50 Cent called him out.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, so it's just got everything that you'd want from a really strong hip-hop album. And I just don't think it gets the credit it deserves. But it definitely goes on the list. It is a must-have. I think, really, production-wise, it was all kind of done in-house, except for one or two tracks by Just Blaze. It was pretty much done by members of the Terror Squad team.
That sounds about right. Again, this is something that take what I say with a pinch of salt, because rest in peace to Big Pun, of course. I was a big fan of the first Big Punisher album. I'm not quite sure why I slept so much on the second one. But what I will say with my little bit of a bullet point is that I like to draw these lines on what I'd call a hip-hop family tree. Mark Williams, would it be fair to say that Big Punisher was the perfect combination of Heavy D, Kool G Rap, and Fat Joe?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, if he hadn't died before this album was released, with the commercial successes it had, the radio airplay it had, I actually think he would have surpassed Big Fat Joe in the success he had in later years. And I think Fat Joe would have took a back seat and pushed him and said, "Okay, go on and do it," because they were that tight. It's a good album. It's a really, really good album. Next one on the list is Dilated People's Platform. I've got to have a mention. Big shout out for that one. Next one is another one I'm going to talk about. Is the first Quasimoto album. Unseen. Quasimoto is an alter ego Lord Quas of Madlib. It was the first album that he released under this alter ego. It's fantastic. However, I would say, before you listen to the album, try and get a copy of the instrumental version of the album first. Listen to the beats. Get into that before you add the vocals to it. Because my personal opinion is the instrumental's better. So listen to the instrumental version prior to listening to the one with the vocals on it, because the vocals are Madlib as well, I believe. They're just digitally.
He pitches his voice up to represent the fact that he's talking with an alter ego. A little bit like how you would say there's Marshall Mathers, the person, then there's Eminem, the rapper, and then there's Slim Shady, the really demonic dark side of Quasimoto is Madlib's dark side, so to speak. So some of the things he says, and also the pitched up vocals, that sometimes can even be at the same time as regular pitched vocals. Can it's a bit Marmite. You'll either love it or you hate it. And Mark Williams, if you remember, we keep on looping back to different people we've had on the show. There is a fantastic Chinatown Slalom track, the name of which has gone out of my head. But on their album from last year, they got the low voices, and then at the same time, they've got the high pitched voice. So if you went to check out the Chinatown Slalom album, and I hope you did, and thank you all, shout out to Chinatown Slalom, they would tell you themselves, I'm sure, that directly or indirectly they were influenced by that album, the Quasimoto, the Unseen, and of course they can correct me online. I apologise if that's not the case, but hugely influential album, even though it's still, Mark, I would say, a best kept secret to some people.
It's one of those albums. It's extremely psychedelic. I remember reading an article. Madlib said that before he did the album, he took mushrooms for a month to get into the zone of making it. It's kind of got a real strong hip hop and dub influence in it. And it's massively slept on. I think all those Quasimoto albums are, to be honest with you. There was one released last year, and not a lot of people talked about it, but it was pretty solid as well. Moving on from that, we're going to move on to a few that we're just going to talk about really quickly. So firstly, we're going to go for a hip hop collective called Jurassic 5. They released their first album that year called Quality Control. I'm not going to say that this one's an absolute banger, but I do like the group, so I think it's a good reference point to go back to where they started. Big L's Big Picture was also released in the year 2000. So rest in peace, Big L. We mentioned Big L before on previous shows. Next on the list is De La Soul's Art of Official Intelligence, which is my favourite De La Soul album after 3 Feet High and Rising, which is like weird because 3 Feet High and Rising is the first one, and this one's the fifth one. There must be some sort of publishing deal because this album isn't available on iTunes. It is only available on Spotify. So if you want to check it out, don't bother on Apple because they don't have the content on there. Great tracks on it, great features on it. I kind of feel like it's a dedication to De La Soul, this album. It's like an album where other artists are being able to go out there and say, you guys are brilliant. And you can see that in the features. Features have got Busta Rhymes, Chaka Khan, Redman, Freddie Fox features on it, Mike D and Ad Rock from the Beastie Boys. So it's kind of like all those guys saying, look, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you guys. And you've taken our music, Chaka Khan, and made it something special. Or the Beastie Boys saying, you made us realise that we can do whatever music we really wanted to do. We didn't have to follow the pattern of the hip-hop criteria. What do you think about this album?
I think it is a fantastic album. I am a little bit of a... I know that De La Soul... and I use this term respectfully, I know that De La Soul nerds, I can't compete with De La Soul nerds. Like, they will battle me on every level. And so this is definitely one of my favourite De La Soul albums. I mean, it's testament to how good De La Soul's catalogue is, that a little bit like, say, Gang Starr and A Tribe Called Quest, you can get 10 De La Soul fans in a room. I've just screwed up the maths, but you get De La Soul fans in a room and they will all put aside a compelling argument for why each different De La album is the best. I think that this is another one of the albums that Mark Williams... I moved to London in January of the year 2000, so talking about a new beginning and excitement for me. Most, if not all, the albums that you've talked about, there's one or two exceptions, but whatevs. Most of the albums here are the soundtrack to my first year in London, and because of the way that you say albums were a thing, and albums had a long shelf life, I was still banging this day in, day out when the part 2 came out some time later, and I know exactly where I was when I heard Ooh, I was exactly where I was when I heard Chaka Khan, I knew exactly where I was when XFM, that was an indie rock radio station, but loved certain hip-hop artists, the crossover, in a good way, a good crossover, folks, played the song with the folks on the Beastie Boys. And like you say, Mark Williams, I think in football, you're a football fan, and I don't really know what I'm talking about, but I think there's a term like a testimonial, where people come together and play in respect of this or that person. Not saying De La Soul were ready to quit, but this was, as you say, a beautiful moment of different people rallying around an iconic group who were far from over, but just needed to smell the roses whilst they could.
Moving on, next album would be Jedi Mind Tricks Violent by Design, another big album, especially in the hip-hop community. And then we're moving on to one that is one of mine and Lee's personal favourites, would be Reflection Eternal, Train of Thought. It's a great album with two iconic artists that we both love passionately. But the next album that I'm going to talk about actually would be the album with the most commercial success, most critical success in the year. The next album I'm going to talk about would be the one with the most critical success in the year, which would be Santana's Supernatural. Now, Santana was and is one of my favourite artists of all time. My dad was mad about him So I've been listening to his music from when I was born, especially those first two albums that came out in 69 and 70. But the story goes that he wanted to do another album because his last one didn't have great commercial success. He bumped into Clive Davis, who actually did his first album and said, Clive, I want to do an album that is commercially viable. All these years I've made music for me. Maybe this time I should try and make music for the people. So Clive agreed, signed him, they did the deal, and this is what came out the other side of it. It's laced with tune after tune after tune after tune.
Yeah.
It was number one in 11 countries. Last year or the year before, it was still being sampled, covered by DJ Khaled when he did the tune with Rihanna. And it also, in some ways, it doesn't. Growing up as a kid, I used to listen to things like Oye Como Va or Samba Pati, which everybody knows from the Marks and Spencer's album for the food and things like that. And I don't think he vies away from that too much. There's the track Smooth with the guy from the band that I'd never heard of, and I'd never heard of the guy before.
Yeah, Matchbox 20, Rob Thomas.
I actually went to go and see him perform it at the London O2. Great album. He, as another interesting fact, other than Michael Jackson, at that point he was the highest nominated for one album. So he had 9 nominations for one album that year. In the Grammys, that is. That's a must-have in your collection. It's got pop tracks on it. It's got those hip-hop tracks, R&B flavoured tracks with Maria. But he's also got those real kind of Latin rock funk tracks, is what I'd like to call them, really. I mean, it's kind of hard to say what it is. He's just an icon in himself. So it's a must-have album. So also in the year 2000, we had Destiny's Child, Writing on the Wall. I believe actually that was released in the US in 1999, UK in 2000.
Got you.
Paul Weller's Heliocentric, Below Coastings, Make and Do, Queen of the Stone Age, Rated R. We also had Bradley Drawn Boy at the hour of Wildebeest, great album.
Love it.
And then we're getting into the era what I reckon is the pinnacle of neo soul, the year 2000.
Yep.
I said that already by talking about the Soulquarians, the Common album, and Voodoo. There's a few albums here that we could talk about. There's Jill Scott, who is Jill Scott. Music Soul Child's I Just Want to Sing, and Erykah Badu's Mama's Gun. So let's start with Music Soul Child's I Just Want to Sing. It was a debut album for him. The hit track on it for me was Merry Go Round. I love that. I play it now all the time. But I started with that one because Jill Scott features on that album as a writer. So we were aware of Jill Scott's talents, and she'd already written tracks. I think she's got a co-write label on The Roots You Got Me with Erykah Badu. So I'd already heard of her prior to that. And then we then got Jill Scott's Who Is Jill Scott, which was a great album. I mean, it's up there with one of my favourite neo soul albums of all time. Again, going through that kind of Soulquarian route. She was discovered by Questlove, so the connection was there. She was always going to succeed from the support and the great talent that she had around her. And whether it was going to be a commercial success was irrelevant. It was always going to be a great piece of music. But when you're talking about neo soul, the queen has to be Erykah Badu. So I'll pass over to you to talk about Mama's Gun.
And this listener, if you hear Mark kind of grinning a little bit and me chuckling and wonder what's so funny, I was definitely super influenced in various ways, both musically and lifestyle, so to speak, by the music that I heard from people like The Roots and Yasin Bey, formerly known as Mos Def in the mid to late 90s. Erykah Badu, D'Angelo, as Mark Williams has said, came with classic albums in the 90s. And I think it was safe to say people went, well, that's the best thing they're ever going to do. I don't know how they're going to top those amazing albums. And then would you believe it, in the year 2000, D'Angelo came out with an album that I would argue is the best album of all time, or at least my favourite album of all time. And what's another album that I go, oh, but what about... when I'm having these little discussions with myself and other people, another album is Erykah Badu's sophomore album, Mama's Gun. This is it's a reverse compliment, because I'll say words like, I could speak about this album all day, so I won't speak for it for long. I think that, again, production-wise, music-wise, everyone involved. Again, another album where it was really a lot of different people coming together and bringing the best out of each other, from, you know, people who are no longer with us, like James Yancey, Jay Dilla, to Roy Hargrove. Rest in peace to those people gone too soon. To the Questloves of the Roots and so on and so forth. Erykah Badu, I think, is slept on as a producer and a beat maker in her own right. And again, I kind of wonder if that's like a gender thing. I'm not sure, but again, that's a conversation for another time. But you will be hard pushed to find an album in any musical style that can be so diverse but so cohesive, so languid and smooth and almost lazy in its getting there, and a jam kind of feel, but at the same time so tight and so focused. There are songs on here that can be so beautiful and uplifting and powerful, but there's some real sadness on here as well. I will start to do that thing where if I say, listener, check out this song or that song, I will end up just listing every song, because this is an album. There are some albums you put on in the background. There are some albums that you stream the one or two hits and make your own playlist to. This is an album that, again, like Voodoo, like Supreme Clientele, like other albums we've mentioned, it is a piece of, think of it as cinema, because the meaning of music has changed in just Mark and my lifetime. I think there are certain albums that, just the same way that you should sit and watch a film, nothing going on but the film in front of you to get immersed in, I think that Mama's Gun is one of those types of albums. As someone who has green eyes, there's one of the most fantastic, playful, and then goes into something else very much not playful, dedications to Green Eyes ever on this album. I could talk all day about Erykah Badu. I could talk all day about this album. But Mark Williams, I'll pass over to you.
You just said there, we see Jill Scott and especially Erykah Badu as songstress, as artists, more than we do writers or beat makers. I think the versus battle that they recently had due to COVID, where they battled each other, was a good way to... Because actually, these guys have got much more to offer than that. Very much like when we discussed the best 80s producer, none of us considered Prince, because we all see Prince as a singer, and not as a beat maker or a producer. I think Erykah falls into that bracket. She became legendary for that first album, very much like D'Angelo did. So it was all against her on the second album, just like D'Angelo, and they produced magic once again. I also think that these people are very, very talented. That's undeniable. But they operated as a collective. So when you talk about these people making music, they're all kind of bouncing off each other. You know, it's not like they would make the music in the same studio. So, you know, you walk in there and you see, oh, well, the Roots are doing this and they're playing this and I like the sound of that, so I'm going to do this and so on and so forth. And I think that's important when you get a collective to work like that, because it gives you new ideas, but it pushes you as well. Not that she needs taking outside of her comfort zone, and I'm not sure that she even has a zone. She just does what she wants when she wants to do it. But it's a fabulous album. But then anything that she does is just fabulous in my eyes. So I won't talk too much about. I suppose the next one on the list would be Outkast's Stankonia, the hip hop duo from the South who we all know and love. Lee, do you want to talk about that one?
I again, in my reverse psychology way, I could talk about this album all day, and because of that, I'll try and keep it to a couple of minutes. You will see that we fall into certain topics and themes within the topics and themes of the show. So the topic theme today is the year 2000 in music, and the subtopics, so to speak, and themes that are coming out are collaborative efforts, people working together when it's for a common cause, and also artists that did not look to cross over to mainstream appeal, and instead, because they were so true to themselves, the mainstream crossed over to them. And I think that both of these different sub-themes are encapsulated on this record and by Outkast. You have got Outkast, of course, Andre and Big Boy, but you have a incredibly solid production team behind them in Organized Noise and Earth Tone 3. So you see Outkast, but you then have their crew of production and artists and singers and rappers and people. I mean, I think this is when the world got introduced to Killer Mike. And he said it himself, one motherfucking verse and already, it's a classic. That's an awful Atlanta accent. I might chop that out. But Killer Mike was on a album with Outkast, who were already legends. And shout out to Killer Mike, because you could tell that they were his folks and so on, because he showed up to that, as Mark always says with the Bernie Mac, I ain't scared of you motherfuckers. I ain't afraid of you motherfuckers. He just ripped it. The album is amazing, both sonically, production-wise, and flows. It's funny. I was on Twitter one day, and I follow Killer Mike, and he said, name some rappers who are underrated. So I mentioned AZ. That's AZ. And Killer Mike came back with that's a fantastic example of an MC that is underappreciated. And he said to Killer Mike, AZ is like a really good combination of Jay-Z and Nas. And as soon as he said it, I got what he meant. And it kind of made me think about other groups and artists, how it might be lazy to say, but how some artists are a combination of other artists, and sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes, people will go, oh, well, if they sound a bit like them, I might as well listen to the original person or so on and so forth. But we talked recently about To Pimp a Butterfly on the show, and on my influenced To Pimp a Butterfly playlist, I had the track Southern Playalistic Cadillac Funkin' Music by Outkast, and there were various reasons. I thought it sat well with Mark Williams talking about Snoop Doggy Dogg's Doggy Style the year before, because Outkast themselves at the time, some people were saying that album sounded very much like a Down South The Chronic. But I digress. We're talking about Outkast in the year 2000. I think that the lyrical ability and the meat and potatoes, shall we say, of Big Boy, and the more, I want to say a word like poetic or more artsy, side of, thank you, so emotional of Andre. I think that if you put both of those rappers together in a single rapper, you could argue that rapper would be Kendrick Lamar. So, there's a little influenced cross-reference there. But we're talking about Outkast Stankonia right now. I think that along with Kid A by Radiohead, this was a perfect example of artists in the year 2000 going, we're not looking for commercial appeal, and we're not looking to do like we did before, but without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because this album is way more psychedelic, way more trap, before trap was quote-unquote a thing to the mainstream. There's music on here that heavy metal heads I know jumped around to, and that rave kids that I knew jumped around to. This came out, I think, in October, November, year 2000. So to hear them referring to the First Iraq War, and there's explosions and hand grenade references and all these types of stuff, to think about, and bombs over Baghdad, to think about the fact that they were chatting about the First Iraq War and the repercussions that had on Americans and black Americans and so on and so forth. When you then fast forward to what happens the following year with September 11 and the Second Iraq War, this is one of those albums where you kind of shift a little bit and go, gosh, this is, this was incredibly prescient. But of course, you've also got crossover tracks like Miss Jackson, which was a Beer Boy favorite, in a way that's akin to Basement Jaxx's Where's Your Head At, where it could have damaged the groups because they caught a very commercial wave, and sometimes that can be the worst thing that happens to an already established band. I could talk about this album all day. I think that when you look at the music and the music videos of people like Flying Lotus, with that black sci-fi psychedelica, Until the Quiet Comes by Flying Lotus, if you go and watch that video, and then you go and watch the video to Bombs Over Baghdad, you check out these kind of similarities and so on and so forth, which of course go back to all types of music like Funkadelic back in the day and so on and so forth, but their evolution or revisiting artists from the past, but coming out with something that a lot of people hadn't heard before, at least in, I don't know, man. It's one of those albums again that if you like Pink Floyd, here's an Outkast song for you. If you like George Clinton and Funkadelic, here's an Outkast song for you. If you like rave music, gospel music, if you like heavy metal and you're a headbanging dude, I saw headbanging dudes banging their heads to Outkast performing Bombs Over Baghdad live in about 2001. Heavy metal dudes, straight up bald heads, leather jacket, black studs on with motorcycle gang patches, all very peaceful folks. I don't mean gang in necessarily a negative way. And they were jumping up and down and screaming, along with the hip-hop kids along with the Wave kids, along with the Neo Soul kids. So, Stankonia, fantastic album. I'm trying to make some sort of really corny, it's a place you want to visit and you might want to stay kind of reference, but I can't do it. But yeah.
I think it highlights evolution. You got to think that when they did Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music in 1994, they were 19. So from the point of that to then Atelians to Aquemini to Stankonia, it's a natural evolution. And I think that by the time they got to Stankonia, is that they decided and they realised artistically and socially who they were. And that comes out in the music because it feels like you said there, a piece of art that we're going to make, and you like it, you like it, you don't like it, you don't like it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the best way to be. And because from that point onwards, we knew what we were going to get. When we got Speakerbox, the next album, the next evolution of that was, well, do you know what? Let's do an album where you artistically influence this side and I'll artistically influence this side. And we'll come in the middle somewhere and we see where we, so it was a constant evolution of both of them. And I think Stankonia might be the pinnacle of that because that's when they decided this is who we are. And even more so because since then, Big Boy's only really done albums with Organised Noise. He's kind of gone full circle, isn't he? He did all those albums and then I think his latest album is just him and Sleepy Brown.
Is it really? Because I've...
Yeah, coming out in 2 or 3 weeks.
See, this is why, I think the listeners probably heard me cringe a little bit when I said I referred to Big Boy as the meat and potatoes kind of side. And I think you heard me wince at the time because I'd kind of contradicted and painted myself into a corner because he goes full circle with Organised Noise, but you know better than I do. He's on tracks with Little Dragon. He does stuff with these European dance acts, which aren't that David Guetta crossover vibe. It's really like he gets that type of... we're talking about a rapper who feels comfortable on MTV Cribs to show both his collection of cars, maybe pole dancing poles in the studio, and he also goes over and shows his collection of Kate Bush records, where this is me. Take me for what I am. So, I should really watch what I say sometimes because I say meat and potatoes and I'm immediately typecasting him. And, you can't put Outkast in a box,
I think one of the best documentaries for visually seeing it is the Organised Noise documentary on Netflix because they talk about how they never fell out. They just kind of both sets, Organised Noise and Goody Mob and they just grew. And then when you grow, then you meet new people who, for example, Erykah Badu, who introduces you to new things and gives you new expression. You want to try it and just see where you go with it. So it was never a falling out. It was just a natural growth. And like I said, you definitely feel like that's part of the process in this album.
I always felt like, and again, I shouldn't really ponder negative elements or things I infer as negative in music. I'm trying to keep it positive these days. I always felt, however, that a big stumbling block in the damn near impeccable catalogue of A Tribe Called Quest, who are often brought up in conversations alongside people like De La Soul and Outkast, was that I think when you listen to the A Tribe Called Quest album, The Love Movement, rest in peace to Jay Dilla and rest in peace to Phife Dawg, I think that is an album where you can hear that people need a bit of time away from one another. And what I am very happy about is to flip it back to the positive side, is that I never got the impression on an Outkast record that they were thinking, this chap again, I have to deal with this guy's baggage, shall we say. It's just like you say, it seemed to be an evolution, and I'm a massive Outkast fan, but I would rather not petition or get at them on Twitter like, when's the next album coming? Because, gentlemen, you've left us with enough stuff that will last many a lifetime. And best of luck to you both in your and Organised Noise in their continued and future endeavours. How can you not love them and be happy for them if they're happy for them?
Massively, 100%. Definitely, the year 2000 could possibly be, it is definitely the best year of music in my lifetime. If you could think of another one, we'd love to hear from you to dispute it. You can get to us at influencepodcast.co.uk, or you can hit us up on Instagram, which is Influenced Music Podcast. Thank you very much for joining us for the show. Lee, thank you very much for participating.
Thank you. It's been a welcome trip down a musical memory lane.
If we've missed out any albums, please get in touch and let us know. Next week, we will be doing a little bit more of a light-hearted show. We're going to be talking about our guilty pleasures. Lee will be back for that one.
I wouldn't miss it for the world.
Mark Anthony will also be joining us as one of my co-hosts. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening. Enjoy this episode, and we look forward to talking to you all again soon. Take care.
Welcome one and all to Influence Music Podcast. We exploring new music and making connections back to previous musical generations via panel debates, conversations and interviews with artists, enthusiasts and media insiders.